again, welcome here. We're going to spend about the next hour together just talking, like I mentioned before, academic integrity, assessment, and artificial intelligence, and particularly the focus on leading the decision-making process. So I've worked with institutions on developing AI policies and guidelines. It is a big task, and particularly for those of us who are leading these initiatives, what are some considerations to take into place, what might come up, and there'll be opportunities in here to discuss. So I encourage you, we're a small group. You are welcome just to raise your hand or just unmute yourself and speak up. I would be happy to hear from you with that, or if you're more comfortable making comments in the chat too, that's just fine. I'll have the chat open on my end where I can see as well if people are popping into the chat and respond. So as much as possible, like I can run this as like a formal webinar presentation, or it can be very interactive. So I'm just going to essentially read the room on this but start with the invite that you're welcome to jump in and share your thoughts. So getting the most out of our hour together. Yes. We've got, I encourage you again, actively participate in the conversation, whether that be chat, whether that just be speaking up. We're a smaller group, so the second one is not so critical, but if we were a larger group, I do just try to encourage them to keep questions and comments to a minute or less, just to include as many voices as possible. And then just letting you all know that the webinar is being recorded. It will be publicly available, so I will be posting it on my YouTube channel. And I always just say that with a caveat, being that we're talking about leadership, sometimes sharing examples, just being mindful that it will be posted in a public place. So please don't share anything that you're not comfortable being posted publicly. And then just what I do, who I am, what I do. So I am a consultant and researcher. I've got expertise in digital learning. So I have a master's degree in educational technology, a PhD in digital learning. I have been working, I'm best known for my work with the Canadian Digital Learning Research Association. I've served there as executive director for a number of years and have been with the organization itself since 2019. I started my career as a middle school teacher with a background in phys ed. So I took a sharp left turn somewhere along the way, having my background first in kinesiology and then going into the digital learning world a little bit later. But I have been working in the digital learning space now for more than 15 years. And it fascinates me as much as I love teaching. When I started doing research and working in digital learning, that's really where I found myself and my interest and passion. And my mission is, just as it says here, to make high quality learning experiences available to more people through strategic and responsible technology use. That includes AI. And it's just really critical for me for the reason that I'll share. This work matters a lot to me. It's deeply personal. I would not have been able to do my graduate studies if I had not been able to learn online and with my PhD through an open institution. And because of the opportunities that technology provides people, I feel really strongly that we need people to feel comfortable using technologies in teaching and learning. And of course, today with our focus on AI, it really is about preparing students for the workforce. And technology integration is an absolute must for what students are going to need to do going forward. So where we're going to go today in our time together. Again, our focus is academic integrity, assessment, and AI. We're going to take a big picture view of this, and I'll talk about the reason why in a moment. And then we're going to explore AI, particularly from an institutional policy perspective. That'll include the teaching and learning piece with the assessment, but we're also going to look, understanding that assessment, academic integrity is situated within the broader institution, which is also facing, issues and challenges related to AI. So with academic integrity and assessment, When we talk about it today, we're gonna talk about how, most of the conversations about AI these days do relate to academic integrity, particularly assessment practices and the conversation that we don't want students to cheat. That is the most common thing. When people want to talk to me about AI, 99% of the time, what they're really wanting to do is have a conversation about academic integrity and assessment. And there's a lot of different concerns and differing opinions out there to navigate. There are people with real concerns, and those come from a valid place. There are also people who are very eager to get things going and to, eagerly and openly adopt this technology, but sometimes without um, thinking through the necessary guardrails that need to be in place too. So there's a balance. And most importantly, there's no one size fits all answers. And I know if you're working on AI policy, I'm sure that you're seeing that. You're seeing that in reality, that everything is so very context dependent in this space. So that's one of the reasons for taking our big picture approach. Because there's no one size fits all answer. So taking a step back was very helpful, but also because it's nearly impossible now to separate AI from other technologies. AI is embedded in many cases into an institution's learning management system. If students are doing a Google search, they're often getting the Gemini AI response, in advance. There's AI on our smartphones. There's AI in almost everything that we're doing. We're encountering AI. So to talk about it as this distinct thing, it really isn't. It's just integrated in so many ways into our day-to-day lives. And it's happened very quickly. And to the point, people might not actually know that they are using AI tools and technologies. A really good example is Grammarly. When people are using that for writing, they might not realize that they're getting AI support when they're using Grammarly to spell check or edit their work. Same thing with Google, not necessarily recognizing that that first little bit that comes up is a Gemini response. So when I'm working with decision makers on AI policies, I really actually encourage them to think and focus on digital transformation more broadly, and that having be the starting point and the lens that they're looking through, just simply because it really is a digital transformation issue. It's a digital literacy issue. AI literacy in and of itself is just a piece of the digital literacy. So to kick things off, as much as people are comfortable, just to get our minds sort of thinking together, I would love either for you to share verbally or in the chat, what advice would you give decision makers for navigating that digital transformation in general, but especially as it relates to academic integrity? So I will open the floor, and then of course I'll share my 2 cents. Amy, yes.
I think my advice would be no different than the advice I normally give about academic integrity, which is that a lot of the time the people who I are talking to, the people who I'm talking to are like first line instructors,
Mhm.
and they need to make a decision about whether or not what they see as an instance of academic misconduct or something that's concerning them vis-a-vis academic integrity, like actually is that thing, or I'm talking to them about how to design an assignment to produce the kind of thinking and skill development that they're looking for. And the first piece of advice I always give my instructors when they come to me and they, are expressing a worry about some possible academic misconduct is they take it very personally. And they think that it's the student trying to like pull the wool over their eyes. And I really encourage them to try to think about this as like, well, that's one possibility, but another possibility is, the student is struggling to achieve the outcomes of the class and they, grasped for the tools that were available to them, and they may have not been aware of guardrails that were put into place, or they might not be able to produce the kind of work that the instructor is really looking for. And then we have to kind of ask ourselves, like, what's our big picture commitment? Are we committed to somehow holding students accountable for every single infringement that they may have, or are we committed to actually educating our students to have them produce the outcomes that we're hoping for? And sometimes, not always, but sometimes those two things are in tension with each other. And you have to kind of go back to your base values.
Yes, thank you. That is that resonates a lot. And I think particularly, and I think I'll be touching on this a bit more, that notion of teachable moments where what is that balance between violation of, that academic dishonesty violation, or really that genuine not knowing, grabbing for tools, not realizing that it's something that they shouldn't be using. Or we see instances too, which I think is important for especially for frontline instructors to realize, students who maybe do make a mistake, they do cheat, and sometimes it's advertised to them on social media channels like Instagram or TikTok or whatever, like, we will write your paper to do this. And it's essentially a scam where they submit their information, they get their first paper written, and then all of a sudden they find themselves in a case where the people are going, okay, now you need to pay us this much money or we're going to tell your institution what you did. And I've heard of a number of situations where that's come up, to the point where, um, you know, students find themselves in very desperate situations, don't know what to do, don't know how to handle that, and really need support coming out of that. And so these are really big challenges that come up, and students don't realize that they're falling for a scam when they do this. They don't realize the harm that might come to them, um, in terms of being extorted, essentially, um, if they do this. So I think it's a lot of that teachable moment. And I always encourage, an AI literacy approach is a generous approach that sometimes has, it's not always possible, but wherever possible, opportunities for second chances to redo, to learn from it. Obviously, if things keep happening multiple times, that's a different situation. But assuming that not knowing, are there any other thoughts?
Just to
Yeah.
continue the conversation, I would say I like your reframe from sort of AI use to digital transformation, because I think it encourages us to take a long view. And that's, what I would say would be a primary piece of advice, is to look back over the history of changes in education, just, in the several decades I've been doing it and even longer, and then to look ahead several decades into the future and navigate the current moment with that long view in mind, rather than simply be reactive to emerging technologies that are of the moment.
Yeah, for sure. And these are not new conversations too that we're having. This idea of academic integrity, and academic integrity typically is tied to assessment, but that's come up since the calculator. The calculator will cause students to cheat. They won't learn critically. The internet will cause students to cheat. They won't learn critically, even when it turned to, the, social media and that access, and mobile devices, to the pandemic, where there was the large shift to online learning. The main concern that came up, well, if students are learning online, how do we make sure that they don't cheat? And then we had the rise of generative AI, which again is that same conversation. How do we make sure people aren't cheating? And now, of course, we see things like wearable devices like Meta Ray-Bans, where if student can be walking to an exam and they might be wearing an AI enabled device, and you can't necessarily check everybody's glasses or tell a student to remove their glasses before an exam. And so it's creating these real discussions about, monitoring things. But at the end of the day, it really does just come down to digital transformation and how do we navigate that and what does that mean for shifting practices. So these are a few of my thoughts. Oh, yes, Carrie, go ahead.
I
Well, if you
I can hold on my thoughts, Nicole. You've got your momentum, so
I've got my
keep
momentum. Okay,
going.
well, I'm going to call back on you as soon as I go through these, and then
No
you
problem.
can add to them. These are sort of my tips, which I recommend for for policymakers for navigating digital transformation, and as I said, including AI. So encouraging proactive strategies in response to versus reactive strategies in response to the changing landscape. What I mean by that is, as much as possible, thinking how students might be using these things. How can we get ahead of them? How can we be putting integrating technologies into the curriculum already? If they're, especially as it ties to the workforce, if they're going to need to know how to do this, what can we do to be teaching them from the start how to use these technologies and how it is appropriate to use these technologies in the classroom? One of the things that I strongly encourage, particularly for the frontline instructors, is to be modeling and to be okay with not knowing about AI and trying new things and saying to students, I am going to be we're for this assignment going to be using this tool, and we might not get it right. And this is how I'm envisioning we use it. This is the purpose why I'm wanting us to use it, having that tied to the learning outcome. Because if we use this technology to complete this assignment, that you're going to learn this in a richer way or in a way that better prepares you for the workforce. And that proactive strategy gives students a way to begin to learn the technological skills that they're going to need, as well as the academic skills, but in a way that doesn't shut that down. I also encourage instructors to make it open. We want for students to ask to use technologies. We want a student to say, can I use generative AI to do this part of my assignment? Or I found this AI tool, can I use this for the assignment? Without getting a negative reaction from their instructor. We want them to ask in advance. And then the instructor can say, A, tell me about it. If they don't know anything about it, tell me about it. How would you use it? How does it work? B, they can say, actually, yes, that makes a lot of sense. You can use that. I'll send an email to the rest of the class too, letting them know that I am going to permit this use of technology in completing this. Or they may say no. By using this technology, you're going to just miss a fundamental learning piece here. I need you to learn this base skill before we can get it. But that proactive way of baking technology into the curriculum is really critical. And of course, having general institutional policies and guidelines that can guide instructors is really critical. The second one is taking an entrepreneurial approach. We don't change everything at once. If someone is running a business and something isn't working, they don't burn the business to the ground and completely restart, but they look at little pieces and say, okay, where can we tweak this? Where can we change this? And so when we're looking at AI, literacies, AI transformation, digital transformation, trying to rather than sometimes again, and I've got this kind of as my final remark for this presentation, that it can feel like a fire hose of information and options coming at you. So sometimes it makes it a lot more manageable, especially for instructors or staff who may not have as much experience with technology and AI, to just think about one thing and say, okay, just this one box, this one assignment, or this one aspect of your course, let's just try changing that one thing, trying something new in this one thing. We don't have to change everything, but let's just try this one thing and see how that works. And it'll either work or it won't work. And if it doesn't work, we're still going to learn something from it too. I encourage focusing on context and function over specific technologies. So when writing out AI policies, I strongly encourage institutions and decision makers not to list a whole long list of specific technologies that are approved or not approved, simply because that list will be out of date by the time you're finished writing the list. Rather, think about what functions students will be permitted to do. So, would a student be permitted to record a lecture and then use AI to transcribe notes? If that's a yes, or a yes for some, maybe it's part of a disability accommodation. It doesn't really matter if they're recording that on their smartphone or if they're recording that on their Meta Ray-Bans. They've got permission to record. So that's the function, and it's in that context. Another example, again, function might be maybe we do want brainstorming ideas. So students can use different tools to brainstorm ideas. It's the function of brainstorming ideas with technology support is permitted. We don't need to list the whole long list of what they can do. Instructors can say, these in the moment, they can say, these are the technologies I recommend you use, but the function is to brainstorm ideas or whatever it is, and it's appropriate in whatever learning context that it is. The identifying, having candid conversations about stuck points. I think higher ed in particular is an area where people come in and they feel like they have to have it all together from the get-go. And so I've noticed that it's sometimes hard for people to be vulnerable about where they're not understanding, where they're not getting it, things that aren't moving forward, things that aren't working as well as they should. And I've done other presentations. I've talked about taking a failure forward approach where we really do encourage and embrace failure. We encourage people to take risks, and where they can analyze and assess their failures and adjust accordingly. And that's a really critical part of the digital transformation. And then just lastly, it's change fatigue, particularly for frontline faculty. With the pandemic, with having to adopt a lot of online, with having to, adopt AI, with all these new technologies coming forward and constantly having to adapt and change, that change fatigue is real. And that sense of burnout and just not having enough psychological capacity to think through how I can do this. So in terms of proactive strategies, what can be done at the institutional level, particularly when developing policies and guidelines, to have built into those policies supports for people, that psychological supports to maybe it's practical supports in some way, but to give people that capacity to develop their digital literacy and AI literacy skills, and that capacity to think through new practices and approaches as well. So that's my spiel. But Carrie, I'm going to turn it back on you. And
Thank you, Nicole. And I'm not sure I can organize my thoughts very effectively. A lot of what you're saying resonates really strongly, with my experience and with some of the research that I've been focusing on in terms of AI and academic integrity and approaches. I think where I might differ a little bit, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. I think it's fundamentally important that we don't respond to AI reactively. Elizabeth, this was the reactivity was something you were talking about. Reactively in a way that scales up monitoring, policing, constraint setting, boundary setting, and then try to entrench that in guidelines or policy, partly because of the reason you noted, Nicole, and that is contextual difference, right? That what works in one context is not going to work in another context. And so at an institutional level, it's really difficult to set all-encompassing, boundaries or policies that will apply evenly across every case. And of course, instructors want this, right? When we work with instructors, we hear them asking for, tell me what rules I can communicate. but ultimately that's a bit counterproductive. But fundamentally, if I think back to me as an instructor, I don't want to spend my time policing my students, and I don't want our relationship to be based on mistrust, an assumption of mistrust that they're going to cheat. I mean, it's really problematic if you have an entire body of faculty who believe that they're doing the right thing within the context of their disciplines, but mistrust the majority of their students. That's a really problematic relationship. So, what is the alternative then if we're not enhancing, monitoring, policing of students? And I think that is to really focus on where our assessment practices are failing. What are we expecting them to do to tell us about student learning, and why are they no longer effective because of the pressure that Gen AI is now exerting on them, right? Where, fluency we took for granted. We assume that fluency signaled certain types of cognitive or epistemic activity leading to a fluent output. Now Gen AI can produce that fluency without the epistemic activity in the background. So what is wrong with that form of assessment then? What do we need to go back and kind of look for anew rather than trying to tighten up limitations, restrictions, or use detection tools, or really kind of entrench our existing assessment practices against this seeming onslaught of Gen AI. So yeah, I think that's where I think I differ a little bit from what you're sharing here.
Yeah, and I think I actually would agree with you. And I think in terms of the assessment, I do fully agree with you that the assessment practices do need to change fundamentally. And that's something I'm going to touch on here because that's something I may touch on again later or skip over later if I'm talking more of it here. But that rethinking assessment and like you say, I'm not a fan. I don't support the idea of like policing and this culture of, distrust, assuming, students are just there to cheat to get the easy way out. I don't believe that to be true. I do believe there's always going to be someone who might try to cheat the system. We're never going to move away from that. But our traditional sort of status quo methods of assessment, we've held them up as a gold standard for a long time for really no good reason other than the fact that they're easy to deliver. It is easy to put people in a room, give them all a paper and expect them to do the same thing in a high pressure environment. And we know from educational research that that's not really a super effective way to measure competency development. What is harder is the fact that the ways that are more effective for assessment take more work for faculty to do ongoing formative assessments, particularly like even in some learning management systems allow for like micro formative assessments going through so that that can be tracked, developing portfolios, and some cases e-portfolios that follow students not just through the course, but follow them throughout their journey in the program so that other instructors can see examples of their work in past courses and follow along in their progress in a way so that through their program, they're moving from, a point A to a point B. And when they graduate, there's really this evidence of learning and competency development throughout. But these ways absolutely create, I'd say, in one sense, they have the potential to create more work. What we see is a lot of solution providers coming in and starting, it's our private companies that are starting to come in and really think through where are solutions that will make this transformation of assessment work. And in some ways, it's a redesign of assignments so that there's more critical thinking happening. Sometimes it's having students give more oral assignments, where they're demonstrating a skill. But in all these things, then that's where that, capacity comes in too. I think a key thing that I didn't have in here, but I think is really important to bring up too, is it's not just students' use of AI in terms of assessment that needs to be addressed, but I've noticed in a number of the policy work that I've done, it's also faculty use of AI and faculty knowing that part of their job as a subject matter expert is that they need to be assessing the students' work themselves. Like that is their job as the expert, not to offload the assessment to AI. In some cases, obviously, if it's, especially if it's like a quiz or something like that that can be done online, that's a bit different. But if we've got, for example, essays that students are writing, there are faculty out there who, would upload student work into a like Chat GPT, which is really problematic for privacy issues as well. But they're not realizing that that is an inappropriate way to be using AI, is to have Chat GPT give them a summary of the student work, or have Chat GPT to give students feedback on that assignment, because the faculty themselves are being hired as that expert. So I think in that navigating transformation, Carrie, to your point, I think, yes, definitely we would want to add that assessment practices. That's where I would put that in, taking an entrepreneurial approach. Let's try building in new assessment practices. Let's try one thing, see if it works in this course, see if we can do that, see the what sort of resources it requires, the capacity it requires of faculty, what supports do we need to put in. And maybe that's where we focus our attention first, is on that, testing assessment practices piece. And then, yeah, I think the other one is just thinking through, you know, what where we can partner with others, what are those appropriate use cases, and what do we need faculty to know in terms of the restrictions for them, not just for students, but what is the role of the faculty member there, and what is the expectation of them? So very good points. I really appreciate that. And I'm actually going to move into another question here, because I think the reason for this question, I think when we think of the future, we can't predict the future. So if we're thinking of the ways higher education might change over the next 5 years, I'm not expecting we're going to land on something, but this exercise is one that I like to use with people in the decision-making policies, because when we're thinking of future, it really helps us pinpoint the problems that we have now, because our concerns for the future are actually tied to what we perceive to be our most pressing struggles now. And same with the hopes for the future. Those are generally tied to the things that we see potentially going well and things that might work. So it helps us to identify the present. So I'd just love to take a few minutes and hear anyone who's wanting to share your perspectives here, any or all of these questions. How do you think higher ed might change over the next 5 years? What steps do you think institutions need to take to prepare for these changes? And particularly, what specific policies do you think are most pressing to be put into place?
I can weigh in from what I
Sure.
see as the US perspective. For many years now, we've been facing a kind of crisis of faith in higher educational institutions and the value they provide to our society. And so I think over the next 5 years, we are going to be increasingly good at explaining what the value is, what the human value add is, and how it differs from other kinds of learning that will be available to lots of different people. I think we need to get very good at articulating that value and explaining it to students in a transparent way where they can connect very directly the experiences they're having in their classes to the value that it adds to their lives in a variety of ways, not just workforce development. And I think the policies, my role at my institution is focused on sort of local ecosystem change. And I think as we think about ways in which faculty may need to rethink older assessment practices that may not suit the current moment, I think the policies need to be adjusted to supporting an ecosystem that can effectively change in the ways that it needs to with the rapid technological advancements that we're facing in the current moment. And so that's where my focus is, at least, and sort of like how do we fertilize a ground on which the innovation that we really need to see can grow effectively.
That makes a lot of sense. The one thing I really like that you said is that human value add and putting that humanity piece into education, because I think that that touches on the important piece that we see that there's going to be a lot of educational opportunities that are going to come at students outside of this sector, and that some of them may be completely AI generated, completely in this loop or this bubble that doesn't have that human interactive piece. So I actually really like framing that in terms of the human piece of higher ed. Carrie.
Yeah, I agree. For me, I think a lot of the policy discussion right now is really focused on ethics, and it places the burden of ethics on the learner. And what I'd like to see is a shift in the discussion to ethics at the institutional and systemic level. So kind of shifting away from trying to solve the encroachment of Gen AI through academic integrity policies and thinking more about um, disciplinary practices, research policies. And the one that I'm really going to focus on, and it may seem a little bit outside of the scope of this conversation, but it's procurement processes. So, the biggest change that I think will happen over the next 5 years is the relationship between post-secondary organizations and ed tech companies who are going to have an increasingly hands-on role in teaching and learning. I mean, some of them are outright nefarious, right? They're hiring SMEs to create content that will effectively replace faculty labor in the relatively short term. So, in that case, the ethics of integrating AI really fall on the institution to ensure that they are vetting tech partners really carefully, that they're asking questions about environmental impact, about their values, about their approach to faculty labor and teaching and learning, and ensuring that those partnerships um, meet the criteria that they would like to, see extended to students, to the whole learning community. So yeah, procurement, I think, is a really big one. And again, shifting focus away from the ethics of student learner behavior to the ethics at a systemic level, which will then necessarily lead into teaching and learning practices.
Yeah. I fully agree. Actually, discernment is one of the key things that I talk about, particularly um, when thinking about in terms of an AI guidelines or policies for an institution. There's all these different pieces and compartments that need to go in. You imagine like a policy document is going to have different sections in it, and one of that is going to be who is the one who sets the rules, who is the one who is doing the procurement piece, because that really impacts teaching and learning. It impacts assessment if we're having an e-portfolio provider, if we're having the learning management system that's coming in and what they're doing with it. If we're developing online programs, we've got an online program management company coming in. If we have, even if it's, it's technologies that integrate into the learning management system, whether that be some sort of game or whether that be AI tutoring that comes in, an AI tutoring or AI support company that comes in. All of these things are very real. And there are, like you say, Carrie, there are um, companies that are not running on ethical practices. And there's companies that are doing a fantastic job and who are really, really genuinely, yes, they're for-profit companies, but they genuinely do care about the learner experience. And it is equipping decision makers to be able to discern between the two and what are the characteristics of a company that is, not going to be doing good things, and what are the characteristics of one that is? And that can be a tricky challenge too, because when doing the procurement, you're often working with salespeople who are putting on the best faces and case examples, and what does that look like for an institution? I think for my ones, I do imagine there being, I think it's, I think the change to technology integration is going to be huge. I think this notion that we have this classroom that is very, even if the on-campus courses are just going to be so much more technologically integrated, I think it is going to be very hard to distinguish between in-person learning and hybrid learning. I think those two are actually just going to almost become one and the same in terms of modality, just sort of different flavors of it. And to prepare for those changes, I actually agree both, Elizabeth, what you said about that human piece. What is our role? Like when what I said before with instructors assessment, we want those subject matter experts who can discern the outputs of AI to be leading the classes, who can help students be thinking critically and, planning, guiding them through these things as they're facing all this technology use. But I think too that the steps that institutions need to prepare, I think one of the inevitable things is we are going to see more private partner and public, particularly. So the Canadian context, most of our institutions in Canada are publicly funded. We don't have as many private institutions as the US and some other countries, but just in terms of funding, those private companies can do things sometimes much more efficiently. And yes, there's a fee for service, but they can get things done. So putting those things in place, and I think those policies that look at the system as a whole are really critical. Amy, is there anything you wanted to add to that before I move forward?
There are ways in which I think higher education will change very little over the next 5 years. And then there are ways in which I think back 5 years ago, like right before the pandemic started, and the idea that I might be even moderately comfortable leading an online course would have blown my mind, you know? And now I think I can say I'm at least moderately comfortable doing so. I think I can foster real learning and real community and connection. I just think it's on some level a failure of my imagination. On some level, my teaching is around getting students to read books. And I don't think books are going to go out of style. Um, so, but I also, I look back on 5 years ago and I think, well, if that's the kind of change I'm going to have in the next 5 years, I can't, there's a sense in which I can't even imagine what it will look like. And because of that, I think like on the steps, what are steps that institutions need to take? I think the only way in which I was able to learn those skills was because I was provided models uh, to observe and then to be able, and then have lots of ready access to people who could help me tweak what was available to meet my needs. So a lot of support was provided at that pivot moment. And I worry a little bit that we might be pulling back on the kind of support and just asking instructors to go and like, somehow teach themselves. And it doesn't always work that well. So yeah, so steps that the institutions can take is to kind of regularly provide opportunities for current instructors to observe new teaching practices and new teaching technologies and ask questions and be supported by people who can genuinely answer those questions.
Yeah, I think that that's an excellent point. Very, very much so. And having that modeling piece, and that to me is a key part of that faculty. Digital literacy for instructors is being able to hear from other people what they're doing, what those experiences are, almost, building in some sort of community of practice for instructors at the institution. And particularly, like I had said before, where they can also talk about what didn't work and those failures. And I tried this didn't work, because someone may be able to chime in and say either like, oh, well, have you thought about just doing this piece of it a little bit differently? Or someone else might say, I tried that too, it completely failed, but here's what I did instead. And so I think that that safe place is really important, and that sharing in community. Um, in terms of just thinking ahead, these are the things as well that so I've done research, I've asked those questions in research studies, particular, we focused on AI, focused on the future. And I think what I hear in the research that I've done, the concerns that when people are thinking of the future is the impact on critical thinking, the impact on competency development of, both of these are related to both technologies, but more so how it's being approached in teaching and learning, the impact on readiness to use technology and on the job. So some of that comes with concerns about restrictions of AI and other technologies in the classroom. If it's being restricted because we're worried students will cheat, are they then going to graduate not ready for the workforce? And we are, anecdotally, I'm hearing a lot that is happening. And then, of course, that's impacting students' employment opportunities. If they're graduating and you know, they're not ready for employment, then it's a challenge. And we're hearing that, students now, employers aren't necessarily wanting to, spend a lot of time onboarding students. They are wanting students to, show up on the job, having these technology skills ready to go. And that's having, technology skills alongside those academic skills. So just some general policy. We've really just, covered this mostly, that, academic integrity concerns relating to technology use, they're not new, that the calculator, internet, AI, it's all brought about the same concerns. And I think, we've really covered those primary underlying issues there. And I think, Carrie, you're the one who sort of really hit the nail on the head there with it's an issue of trust. And how do we create learning communities in post-secondary that are trust focused, they're centered on trust, and they're not operating on the assumption that, students are going to try to cheat whenever they can. And at the same time, what guardrails do we put into place to give students the most high quality learning experience they can have while having it technology integrated and using technology to enhance, rather than using technology always for the most efficient route. And one of the key things, so when I'm working on policy development with groups, I always come back to reorienting on student outcomes, because everything that we're doing at an institution, so if we're looking, again, Carrie's, talking about the systemic view, if we're looking at higher ed at that biggest picture level, that systemic level, at the end of the day, the purpose of higher ed is to produce a certain student outcome. Students come into a higher ed institution, they go into a program, and they are expecting to leave that program having some sort of outcome, having some sort of competency that they've developed. And we hope that during that, as the process of that, they're also learning citizenship skills, critical thinking skills. And in this, we're talking about the 18, typical 18 to 24-year-old student, but this also applies to professional students, students who are coming in the graduate level, students who are starting diploma, university studies at a different stage of life where they're balancing careers and workforce. All of these things, when we're thinking about digital transformation, when we're thinking about AI use, at the end of the day, it is, what are the competencies that students are going to need to develop for their careers? That is very context and field dependent, but that's something that really we need to keep coming back to instead of getting caught in the weeds on, well, this little thing here or this little thing back here. When I notice when I'm working with task force groups or different groups, and we start falling down that rabbit hole and getting caught into the weeds, just bringing everybody 10 steps back to what are the academic, technological competencies that students are going to need to develop. And that's a really good exercise to do at the department level or program level too. When people get caught up, is just, okay, well, what do we need them to know when they get out into the workforce? And then that needs to be very tied. For instructors, one of the key things is there is a new expectation on instructors now to be very familiar with how AI is being used in their field of studies and how students will be expected to use that in their career. Some disciplines are very well connected to industry, and this isn't an issue for them because there's certain regulations that they have to meet or certain standards that they have to meet, so that the instructors do really need to stay very tied to industry. Some disciplines, not so much, but it still is very relevant to how it is being used currently in the workforce. And then I like to put the justification for technology use, but also its disuse in a context. And I touched on that before, where we might say, if a student is bringing technology, for example, to a faculty member, to their instructor and saying, I'd like to use this in the course, the instructor might say no, but they can give a really good justification for not doing that. Another example is in exams. So if there might be a justification for going back to like blue book exams, there might be a justification, but you need to justify it. Because students will cheat if I don't do it this way, isn't the right justification. But if it's related to their ability to demonstrate their work, critical thinking, it might be that we're okay with them videotaping themselves, giving an oral presentation, delivering that online. And that's fine because it's justified. But the key thing is that justification for its use or its disuse. So if we're not using it, we need to justify it in the same way that we are using it in this day and age, just because it's so integrated into our lives and so expected of students in their career. And so just to wrap things up, because we're at the top of the hour, we talked about modeling the use as well in their courses. So I will send out this. I've got a few more things. We covered all of these things in here: discernment, ethics, rationale, environmental impact. That is a lot what, Carrie, you were talking about with the systemic approach. And again, these are just the guiding principles and, that change management piece, taking that big picture approach, thinking about how each person at an institution might encounter or use AI in their activities, and thinking through who is going to be responsible for making each of these decisions at these levels, and what do they need to know, like we were talking about with procurement, to discern and make good decisions in that. So again, last thought, like I said before, fire hose of information with technology advancement, but helping people focus on what they need to know in their role and reminding them that no one needs to know everything. So to wrap it up, this is my contact information to reach me. I've got email address there. If you're not a member of the Digital Learning Leadership community, I am trying to do webinars like this once a month. This is a community I launched just at the start of 2026. And right now, it's just mostly an email letter that lets people know we've got resources that are coming out and monthly discussions like this online where we can just connect and talk about these issues. So with that said, I can stay on for a few more minutes for any questions that anyone might have. I'll stop recording. But thank you all.